Rain tapped softly against the cracked windows of the abandoned radio tower outside Boulder City, Nevada. The desert wind howled through the rusted chain-link fence, and the skies remained permanently overcast with the ash of fallen cities. It had been 3 years since the outbreak began, 3 years since the dead stood up and started walking. No one really knew how it started. Some blamed a virus, others pointed to a military experiment gone wrong, but whatever the cause, the world had fallen fast. Cities became tombs, governments collapsed, and the internet, once the backbone of modern civilization, had gone dark. Only whispers traveled across the airwaves now. Whispers, and something else. 17-year-old Jamie Carver sat in the corner of the dusty control room, eyes locked onto a battered radio transceiver humming with faint static. He was skinny, with soot-streaked skin and a fire in his eyes that hadn't been snuffed out yet. Across from him, slumped in a chair with a rifle at her side, was Callie Trent, ex-firefighter, part-time mechanic, and the closest thing Jamie had to family. "You're wasting time," Callie muttered, tightening the strap on her worn-out boots. "That thing hasn't picked up a real signal in months." Jamie didn't reply. He adjusted the frequency dial ever so slightly, leaning in as the static gave way to a faint voice. "To anyone still listening, this is not the end." He froze. The voice was male, clear, and calm. Not panicked like most distress calls they'd heard in the past. Callie's eyes snapped open. "Play that again." Jamie tapped the record function. The voice came back, louder this time. "This is Resistance Station 7, broadcasting from what remains of Freehold, Montana. We are alive. We are fighting back. The undead can be resisted. There is a cure, or the beginning of one." Callie stood up, face pale. "That's impossible. Freehold was overrun over a year ago." The message continued, looping every few seconds, each cycle giving more details. "This is Dr. Elias Rourke. We have contained a section of the city. We have resources, shelter, and weapons. But most importantly, we have proof the infection can be reversed under specific conditions. We need help. If you're hearing this, don't run. Don't hide. Come fight." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Jamie exhaled slowly. "Did you hear that? They found a way to fight back." "Or it's a trap," Callie said darkly. "Might be a recording from before Freehold fell. Could lure survivors and just defeat a nest of those things." Jamie looked at her. "What if it's real? What if people hear this and finally start resisting again?" Callie paced the room, torn. "Even if it is real, it's hundreds of miles away. We'd have to cross zombie-infested wastelands, burned-out highways, maybe worse." Jamie looked back at the radio. "We don't have to go. We just have to spread the message." That's when the idea hit him, simple, powerful, and dangerous. They could rebroadcast the message, amplify it using the old repeater stations still working in patches of the country. Not everyone had radios, but those who did, they'd hear the spark. And maybe, just maybe, that spark would light a fire across dead America. Callie sighed. "You want to be the voice that starts a war?" Jamie nodded. "Someone has to. We've been surviving for too long. It's time we start living again." The next 2 hours were spent prepping the tower. Jamie patched the cables and reconfigured the transmitter with shaking hands. Callie took position on the roof, keeping an eye out for anything wandering too close. Distant groans echoed through the desert, the ever-present reminder that danger was always near. At dusk, Jamie hit the broadcast switch. "This is a message to any survivor, soldier, or civilian still alive in dead America. We've received a transmission from Freehold, Montana, Resistance Station 7. They've found a way to fight back. There is hope. There is a cure. If you're hearing this, spread the word. Don't give up. Don't give in. The revolution begins now." The signal echoed into the void. Somewhere, miles away, a battered emergency radio in an underground shelter crackled to life. A weary father turned the volume up. A lone scavenger in Kansas froze mid-step as the voice played through a rooftop speaker. A militia group in Arizona paused their patrol. The message was out. What Jamie and Callie didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that someone else had heard it too. Something that remembered its former life. Something that did not want humanity to rise again. Would you like me to continue with part 2 now? The next few days were quiet, eerily so. Jamie and Callie kept watch over the radio tower, monitoring the frequency, but the world outside remained stubbornly unchanged. The undead still roamed the streets in their disjointed shuffle, unaware of the revolution that had been sparked. But the survivors were listening. By the third day, they started receiving messages back, quick, desperate, fragmented. "We're here. We've been waiting for this, moving west. Can't hold them off much longer, but we're coming. The dead are everywhere, need backup. Please. We'll meet you halfway." The hope Jamie had felt when the broadcast went live started to grow into something more. Something real. This wasn't just a call to arms, it was a rallying cry. People were rising. They were answering. But not everyone was as eager to believe in the message. "Kid, you don't understand," Callie warned, her voice gruff, eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced calm of someone who'd seen too many dead faces. "There's a lot more to survival out there than hope. You can't just send out a signal and expect the world to change overnight. This place, this world, it's broken beyond repair." Jamie had heard this before. He understood. But there was something in the way the survivors responded, something that pulled at him, made him feel like the message was more than just static on the airwaves. There was a real fight coming. And that fight would not wait for them to be ready. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to them, something darker was unfolding miles away. Hidden in the shadows of the radio tower's signal range, an old military outpost stood silent, half buried beneath the wreckage of a broken world. It had been forgotten, abandoned in the chaos of the early days of the outbreak. But its systems, once designed for the worst-case scenario, had never truly powered down. The broadcast had triggered something within the ruins, a series of alarms and automated systems set to respond to any sign of civilization attempting to rebuild. And it wasn't just the outpost that had been alerted. Somewhere, in a dark, neglected facility, deep underground, a figure stirred. It had been months since the first wave of the infection had spread, and while most of humanity fell victim to the virus, not all of it did. A few had managed to survive, partially infected, their bodies altered in ways that defied nature. They had kept themselves hidden, waiting in the shadows for the world to fracture further, to tear itself apart. But this broadcast, had triggered something inside them. Something that made them stand and listen. Dr. Elias Rourke's voice was clear as day to them. And it filled them with rage. They had seen hope once before. They had seen humans struggle to resist. And when they did, when they fought back, they were struck down. But this time, they wouldn't make the same mistake. A large figure, standing over 6 feet tall, walked through the abandoned lab. His face was partially obscured by bandages and a dark hood, but his eyes gleamed with something primal, something otherworldly. He had once been a soldier. A part of a top-secret program designed to combat the undead. But his mission had failed. The infected had consumed everything, and now he was no longer just a man. He was a part of them. He had become a hunter. The figure, known only as Cenarius, was a leader of the infected who had resisted the total corruption of the virus. His mind, his will, had been distorted but never broken. And now, he was determined to stamp out the revolution before it could gain momentum. To him, humanity's resistance was a threat to be erased. He activated a terminal, sending out a command to a hidden network of similar beings scattered across the ruins of America. The revolution had just begun, and so had their war. Back at the radio tower, Jamie didn't know that the danger was much closer than he thought. Every day, the messages piled in, each one confirming that more and more survivors were willing to join the fight. A network of resistance was forming, and Jamie had to be ready to lead them. But Callie was still uncertain. The weight of the past bore heavily on her, and every piece of optimism Jamie held onto felt fragile to her. "We need to keep moving," she said one morning, as they sat over a small fire. "I'm not saying the broadcast wasn't important, but we can't stay here forever. This place, it's not safe anymore." Jamie nodded. He'd known that even before Callie said it. The undead didn't care about messages. They only cared about feeding. And while they had a signal now, they were still in the middle of the wasteland. Getting to Freehold, or even to the nearest group of survivors, was a long shot. But it was the only shot they had. As they packed their gear and prepared to leave, the broadcast crackled to life again. This time, the voice was different. "This is Dr. Rourke again. We've encountered resistance. The undead are adapting faster than we anticipated. But we're holding them off. Please, we need more supplies and reinforcements. Freehold isn't safe anymore." The message was chilling. Rourke's words only confirmed what they feared. The undead weren't just mindless animals, they were learning, evolving, becoming something far more dangerous. The fight was about to get a lot harder. But Jamie wasn't backing down. He couldn't. With a determined look in his eyes, he grabbed his pack and nodded to Callie. "Let's go." The revolution had started, and there was no turning back. "Would you like me to continue with part 3 now?" The road out of Boulder City was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made Jamie feel like the whole world was holding its breath. The city's crumbled remnants lay behind them, and the desert stretched out before them, empty, lifeless, save for the occasional groan of the undead drifting through the wind. Jamie and Callie had loaded up their gear and set out at first light, driven by the same determination that had fueled Jamie's decision to broadcast the message. They knew that their survival depended on finding other pockets of resistance, building alliances, and pushing forward despite the odds. "I still don't like this," Callie muttered as they walked, her rifle slung across her back, eyes scanning the horizon. "We're putting ourselves in the crosshairs. If someone's got eyes on us, we won't even see it coming." Jamie didn't answer right away. He understood her concern. The world had become a place where trust was a luxury few could afford, and the undead weren't the only threat. It was easy to lose yourself in paranoia, to assume that anyone who wasn't part of your group was a threat. But the broadcast had ignited something in him, a spark of hope he couldn't ignore. They were spreading the message, yes, but they were also looking for more than just survival. They were looking for a way to fight back. To live again, rather than just exist. They had been traveling for hours, keeping their distance from the main roads, sticking to the cover of sand dunes and abandoned structures. Every so often, they'd hear the distant moan of a zombie or the telltale shuffle of their feet. But nothing had come close enough to warrant a fight. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Callie motioned for them to stop. She crouched low, peering through binoculars at a cluster of buildings up ahead. Jamie followed her gaze, his heart rate quickening. He couldn't see anything clearly, but the way she was scanning the area said everything. "What's up?" he whispered. "Movement," Callie replied. "Too much for comfort. We need to circle around. This isn't a place we want to be after dark." Jamie hesitated. He didn't like the idea of doubling back. They were already miles from the last known safe zone, and Freehold was still too far to reach in one day. But Callie had more experience, and he knew better than to second-guess her instincts. "We'll take the long route," Jamie said, trying to keep his voice steady. The sun set as they adjusted their course, heading into the thickening shadows of the night. With each passing hour, the air grew colder, and the sound of distant growls seemed to draw closer. The world felt like it was closing in on them. By nightfall, they had found a narrow ravine to set up camp. They lit a small fire, just enough to keep warm and cook their rations, but not enough to attract attention. Jamie leaned against a rock, staring into the flames, thoughts racing. "We're getting close," he muttered. "Freehold's not far now." Callie didn't answer right away. She was keeping watch, her eyes scanning the surroundings with sharp precision. When she did speak, her voice was low, thoughtful. "You know, for someone who's never been this far into the wasteland, you've got a lot of confidence," she said. Jamie shrugged, though he didn't feel quite as confident as he sounded. It's not about confidence. It's about doing what's right. The people in Freehold, they're fighting back. That's more than we've had in a long time. Callie nodded but didn't reply. She knew the stakes were higher than Jamie realized. They weren't just heading into Freehold to find shelter, they were going to face something far more dangerous. The broadcast had spread hope, but it had also attracted attention from forces that didn't want humanity to rise again. That very night, as Jamie drifted into a fitful sleep, Callie stayed awake, her mind racing. She had seen how quickly things could turn deadly, how easily hope could become a weapon against those who dared to fight. And she knew that even though Freehold was supposed to be a place of safety, there was no such thing anymore. The undead weren't the only danger in this new world. As she kept watch, a low rumble echoed through the ground, faint at first, but growing stronger. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that sound. A vehicle. The unmistakable growl of an engine, broken, ancient, but moving. Her hand went instinctively to her rifle. She stood up slowly, peering over the ravine's edge. The vehicle came into view, an old, rusted military truck, covered in scrap metal, rolling slowly through the sand. The headlights flickered like dying stars. But it wasn't the vehicle that made her pulse quicken. It was the figures in the back. A handful of survivors, armed to the teeth, their faces grim and hardened. They weren't alone. Callie's eyes narrowed as she spotted the leader of the group, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek. His gaze swept over the ravine, and for a moment, their eyes met. He saw them. "Jamie!" Callie whispered urgently, her voice sharp. "Get up. Now!" Jamie jolted awake, grabbing his gear and pulling it together as quickly as possible. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. "They're not alone," Callie said. "Get ready." In the distance, the truck pulled to a stop. The group dismounted, weapons raised, scanning the area. Callie had seen this before. This wasn't a friendly group of survivors. They were hunters. And they weren't looking to join a revolution, they were looking to control it. The sudden tension in the air made Jamie's blood run cold. Callie had already dropped into a crouch, her rifle ready, eyes locked on the group of survivors who had parked just a few hundred yards away. She motioned for Jamie to stay low, her hand held up in a silent signal. Jamie's heart thudded in his chest as he scanned the group through the dark. They were heavily armed, but not in the way most survivors were. This wasn't a makeshift militia. They moved with precision, each step calculated, as if they were trained for something more dangerous than just scavenging. "They're ex-military," Callie muttered, her voice barely a whisper. "Or at least, they think they are." Jamie nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He'd seen enough to know that these weren't people who could be reasoned with. The look in their eyes was hard, hardened by too many years of surviving, by too much death. But even more terrifying was the fact that they weren't alone. The shadows around them seemed to move, and Jamie could hear the unmistakable shuffle of the undead, drawn in by the truck's noise. "We need to move," Jamie whispered urgently, his eyes darting between the men and the undead that were beginning to circle them. Callie's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "Not yet," she said, her eyes trained on the figures. "We wait for the right moment." The tension in the ravine grew unbearable as the hunters fanned out, systematically searching the area. Jamie's breath was shallow, every sound amplified in the quiet night. He knew that if they were spotted, there would be no escape. The only chance they had was to stay hidden, to blend in with the night. The truck's engine rumbled again as a heavy-set man climbed out of the back. His movements were slow, deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice was deep and commanding. "I know you're out there," he called out into the night, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. "There's no use hiding." Jamie's stomach churned. So much for staying hidden. A sudden growl erupted from the shadows, and the hunters immediately turned their weapons in the direction of the sound. Zombies, attracted by the truck's noise, began to shuffle into the open, drawn by the scent of the living. The lead hunter's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. "Check the perimeter," he barked at his team. "We're not alone. Stay alert." The group split, moving methodically as they combed the area, sweeping the landscape for any sign of life. Jamie felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as the undead grew closer. His grip tightened on the rifle slung over his shoulder, ready to defend himself if it came to that. Callie leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't take them all on. There's too many. We need a plan." Jamie's mind raced, trying to think of an escape route. There had to be a way out of this without drawing attention. But there was no easy solution. The hunters were too skilled, and the zombies were too close. Then, as if on cue, one of the hunters yelled out in pain. A figure, much faster than the undead, darted across the ground, a shadow in the night. It was a survivor, someone who had been hiding just as Jamie and Callie had, waiting for the right moment. The hunter who'd been attacked staggered back, clutching his side as blood poured from the wound. "Ambush!" he screamed, as the rest of the group turned to face the new threat. In that instant, Jamie realized that the situation had just changed. The zombies, now fully aware of the commotion, surged forward with a mindless hunger. But the hunters, instead of retreating, dug in, drawing their weapons and firing at the approaching undead. The chaos was instant. Gunshots rang out in the night, the harsh noise of human conflict mingling with the guttural growls of the infected. Jamie felt the adrenaline surge through him as he glanced at Callie. "This is our chance," she said, her voice steady, though her eyes were sharp. "We move now." No hesitation. Jamie nodded, and the two of them slipped from their hiding place, moving quietly toward the edge of the ravine. The gunfire and chaos provided a perfect cover as they made their way toward a narrow path that would lead them around the fighting. As they moved, Jamie's thoughts were a jumble. These hunters weren't just some random group, they were organized. They had strategy. They knew how to fight the undead. But they also knew how to fight survivors. And that meant they weren't looking for allies. They were looking for control. Jamie's fingers tightened around his rifle, but he didn't take a shot. Not yet. This wasn't the time for confrontation. The ground beneath them was soft, the air thick with the scent of decay as they moved swiftly through the darkness. Jamie's heart raced, not just from fear, but from the realization that the revolution they had started was bigger than he had ever imagined. As the distant sounds of gunfire began to fade, Jamie and Callie reached a small hill that offered a clear view of the battle below. From here, they could see the survivors, those who had ambushed the hunters, fighting for their lives against the undead, and for control against the ruthless hunters. The battle was chaotic, but it was clear that Jamie's mission was no longer just about survival. The revolution was gaining traction, but it was also drawing out those who would stop at nothing to crush it. "There's no going back now," Callie said quietly, her eyes on the struggle below. "The world's changed. We'll never just be survivors anymore." Jamie nodded. The revolution had already started, and no matter how many people tried to stop it, there was no turning back. But as he watched the chaos unfold, Jamie knew one thing for sure: they had to keep moving. The fight was only just beginning. The battle raged below them, each shot and scream punctuating the air like a grim symphony. Jamie and Callie stood in the shadows, watching the chaos unfold. They knew they couldn't stay long. If they lingered too long, they would be caught in the crossfire between the survivors and the hunters. But they had to know what was happening. They needed to understand who these people were and what they stood for. Jamie's heart was heavy with the weight of the situation. The message he had broadcasted was supposed to inspire hope. It was supposed to be the spark that lit a fire in the hearts of survivors, a fire that would lead to a new world. But now, as he looked down at the fighting below, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The revolution wasn't just a movement, it was a war. A war with no rules, no mercy. "This is what we're up against," Callie muttered, her voice tight. "Factions. Alliances. People fighting for control in a world that's already fallen." Jamie's gaze never wavered from the scene below. The undead were swarming, as they always did, but it was the survivors that caught his attention. There were no lines between good and bad here, just a collection of people doing whatever it took to survive, even if that meant becoming something less than human. "They're not fighting for survival anymore," Jamie said, his voice distant. "They're fighting for power. For control. And they'll do whatever it takes to get it." Callie turned to him, her expression hardening. "And we're caught in the middle of it." He nodded. "We have to make sure the revolution doesn't become just another power struggle. It's not about control. It's about survival. It's about finding a way to live again." The sound of gunfire rang out, closer this time. It was coming from the survivors who had ambushed the hunters. A few of them were making a break for it, trying to escape the horde and the gunfire. They weren't going to last long. The undead were closing in, and the survivors were too scattered to hold their ground. "We can't just stand here," Jamie said, his voice hardening. "We need to help them." Callie looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing his words. She knew the risks. Helping these people could mean getting caught in a fight they weren't prepared for. It could mean more than just a few casualties, it could mean their deaths. But Jamie's resolve was unshakable. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. They had to do something to turn the tide. "All right," Callie said finally, her voice resigned. "But we do it my way." Jamie nodded in agreement. He trusted her judgment more than his own at this point. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They moved quickly, staying low as they navigated the rocky terrain. The sounds of the battle grew louder as they approached, but they kept their distance, watching the scene unfold. The survivors were making a desperate stand, firing on the approaching zombies while trying to keep the hunters at bay. It was clear that they were outnumbered and outgunned, but there was something in their desperation that struck a chord with Jamie. These were people who weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for a future. As they moved closer, Jamie could see one of the survivors, a woman with short-cropped hair, firing a rifle into the approaching undead. Her hands shook, but her eyes were fierce. She was a leader, a survivor who had learned how to stand tall in a world that had long since lost its humanity. "She's one of them," Callie whispered, her voice tense. "She's one of the ones who heard the broadcast." Jamie nodded. He could see it now, the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had driven him to speak out. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was trying to build something. Something that could stand against the horrors of the new world. They couldn't leave her to die. They couldn't leave any of them. As the horde pressed in, the survivors were starting to fall back. The hunters were closing in too, their heavy boots pounding the earth as they advanced. This was their territory now. The survivors had no hope of winning this fight unless something changed. Jamie made a split-second decision. "We need to create a diversion," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "If we can draw the undead toward the hunters, we can give the survivors a chance to escape." Callie looked at him, eyes narrowing. "You're insane." "But I like it." Jamie gave her a wry smile. "If we're going to survive this, we need to be crazy." They moved swiftly, circling around the battle, staying out of sight. Jamie's mind was working fast, calculating their next move. They had one shot at this. They couldn't afford to fail. The truck that the hunters had arrived in was still parked near the battlefield, its engine idling. Jamie spotted a group of zombies creeping closer to it, drawn by the noise and the scent of the living. He nodded to Callie, and she understood immediately. The plan was simple but risky. They would create a loud enough distraction to attract the undead toward the truck, drawing the zombies away from the survivors and the hunters. Callie crouched low and pulled a flare from her pack, lighting it with a quick flick of her wrist. The bright red light flared to life, casting an eerie glow across the landscape. Jamie took a deep breath and, with a sharp movement, kicked over a pile of debris near the truck. The sound was loud enough to draw the attention of the zombies. As the undead turned in their direction, Jamie and Callie sprinted to the truck, sliding under its cover just as the first wave of zombies began to shift toward the noise. The undead surged forward, their grotesque bodies shuffling toward the flare, giving the survivors their chance to escape. But Jamie knew this was just the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, one filled with more danger, more bloodshed, and more battles. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, a flicker of hope. This revolution wasn't over. Not yet. The flare burned brightly, casting a red hue over the ravine as the undead were drawn toward the fire. Jamie and Callie took the opportunity to move swiftly through the shadows, staying low to the ground as they made their way toward the survivors. The plan had worked, at least for now. The zombies were distracted, and the survivors had started to break away from the hunters, running for cover. As they reached the survivors' makeshift barricade, Jamie's heart was pounding. They had no idea if their diversion had been enough to save everyone, but it had given them a fighting chance. Now, it was up to the survivors to make it out alive. The woman with the short-cropped hair was still fighting, her rifle popping with each shot she took. But even as she fired, Jamie could see the desperation in her eyes. She was outnumbered, and the hunters were closing in. Her chances of survival were slipping away with each passing second. Jamie's instincts kicked in. They couldn't just stand by and watch. Not again. He turned to Callie, who nodded grimly in response. "It's time," she said, her voice low but steady. "Let's finish this." Together, they made their way to the edge of the barricade, taking up positions behind a pile of rubble. Jamie's heart raced as he peered through the gap, watching the survivors struggle to hold their ground. The hunters were relentless, pushing forward despite the growing number of zombies behind them. It was clear now, the hunters weren't just fighting for control of the area. They were hunting the survivors down, picking them off one by one. But Jamie had a different plan. He pulled out a small radio, one of the few things that had survived the chaos, and tuned it to the frequency he had used to broadcast the message that had started it all. It was risky, too risky, but there was no other way. "Callie," Jamie said, his voice tight with determination. "I'm sending out another message. This time, I'll make it clear. The revolution isn't just about surviving. It's about taking back the world." Callie gave him a sharp look, but there was no hesitation in her voice. "I'm with you. Just make it count." Jamie took a deep breath, holding the radio up to his mouth. He clicked the button, and then his voice echoed into the night. "Survivors of America," he began, his words carrying across the frequency. "You've heard the message. You've seen the truth. But now it's time for something more. The undead are not our only enemy. There are those among us who seek to control, to rule, to enslave. But we will not stand idly by. We will not be silent. The revolution is here. And it's time to rise." His words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, as if the very silence of the world was holding its breath. But then, as if on cue, the ground shook with the sound of another explosion, this one coming from the direction of the battle. The explosion was followed by a massive wave of noise, the sound of gunfire, the scream of tires skidding across the earth. Jamie's heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. The survivors were making their move. The revolution had begun. "Now," Jamie whispered to Callie. They both sprang into action, racing toward the survivors as the chaos erupted around them. Callie's rifle was already in her hands, and Jamie's fingers were wrapped tightly around his weapon. They moved in sync, taking out a few of the undead that were too close to the barricade, giving the survivors a brief moment of respite. The woman with the short-cropped hair looked over at them, her eyes widening with recognition. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face said it all. She knew who they were. She knew what the message meant. Jamie gestured to her, signaling for her to fall back. She nodded, and with a final glance at the chaos behind her, she began to retreat toward the safe zone with a few of the others. But Jamie knew they couldn't leave just yet. They had to finish what they started. The remaining hunters were now in full retreat, their faces hard with the realization that they had underestimated the strength of the survivors, and the power of the revolution. The group of survivors, emboldened by Jamie's broadcast, were pushing forward, fighting back with a newfound sense of purpose. They weren't just trying to survive anymore. They were fighting for something more. Jamie and Callie continued to cover their escape, taking out the remaining undead that got too close. It wasn't a flawless plan, there were too many moving parts, but it was enough. The survivors were making it out. As the last of the group disappeared into the safety of the barricade, Jamie took a moment to catch his breath. His heart was still racing, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. But as he looked over at Callie, he could see the same determination in her eyes that had been there when they started this journey. "We did it," she said, breathing heavily but smiling. "But this is only the beginning." Jamie nodded. He knew the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were on the verge of something big. Something that could change everything. "This is just the first step," Jamie said, his voice low but resolute. "The revolution's going to spread. We'll find more survivors. We'll make them believe. And together, we'll take back this world." Callie smiled, her eyes gleaming with something fierce. "Let's make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." As the last echoes of the battle faded away, Jamie looked up at the stars above. They were still out there, the zombies and the hunters. But they had taken a stand. They had sent a message. And the world would never be the same again. The survivors were no longer running. They were moving with purpose now, their every step driven by the words of the broadcast. Jamie watched as they fortified their new camp, using whatever resources they could find, scraps of wood, broken-down vehicles, and anything that might offer them some protection against the undead that roamed the area. The barricades they set up were crude, but they were enough to give them a fighting chance. The woman with the short-cropped hair, whom Jamie now knew was named Mara, was leading the survivors with an efficiency that surprised him. She wasn't just a fighter, she was a strategist, a person who understood that survival in this world wasn't just about brute strength, it was about unity, about planning and outsmarting the threats that constantly loomed over them. Mara approached Jamie as he stood near the fire, gazing out into the distance. He could hear the faint sound of moaning in the air, the undead shuffling somewhere in the dark, but it was quieter than it had been during the battle. For now, at least, they were safe. "You've got a hell of a way with words," Mara said, her voice gruff but appreciative. That broadcast, it inspired them. "I've seen people fight for food and shelter, but this is different." Jamie didn't know how to respond. The truth was, he had no idea how much his words had truly changed. He'd simply done what he had to do, what he thought would be enough to light a spark. But hearing it from Mara, seeing the way the others now moved with renewed energy, made him realize that this was bigger than anything he had expected. He gave her a half-smile. "I didn't do it alone. Callie was right there with me. And you're the one who's keeping it together." Mara gave him a brief nod. "We all have our part to play. You started the fire. Now it's time to keep it burning." Her eyes scanned the survivors. "But there's something we need to talk about." Jamie turned to face her fully, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What's on your mind?" "There's a group, one that's been watching us. They're not undead, but they might as well be. They call themselves the Warden Collective, and they don't take kindly to uprisings. They're not here to save anyone, they're here to control what's left of the world." Jamie felt a chill run down his spine. Control? What does that mean? It means they'll do anything to suppress any movement that doesn't fit their vision of the future. If they catch wind of what we've started, she trailed off, her eyes darkening. It could mean the end before it even begins. Callie, who had been quietly listening nearby, stepped forward. "We've fought our way out of worse situations. We can handle this." Mara looked at Callie, sizing her up for a moment before responding. "It's not just about fighting. The Warden Collective doesn't play by the same rules as everyone else. They've got weapons, intel, and people in places we don't even know about. If they find us, they'll crush us before we ever get a chance to fight back." Jamie knew she was right. They had barely managed to escape the hunters, and now they were facing an even greater threat. The Warden Collective was a shadowy group, rumors swirling about their ruthlessness. They were more than just a faction, they were a power, and their methods were deadly. "We'll need more than just numbers to fight them," Jamie said, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "We need information. We need allies." Mara nodded. "There are scattered survivor groups around here. Some of them might be willing to join us if we can prove that this revolution is more than just talk. But it won't be easy. The Warden Collective has eyes everywhere." "We've got eyes too," Callie said, her voice filled with resolve. "And we're not going down without a fight." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what they were about to undertake hanging heavy in the air. They had sparked a revolution, but now they had to protect it. They had to fight for it, and that meant making hard choices and taking risks. "All right," Jamie said finally, his voice steady. "We move out at dawn. We'll scout out the nearest survivor groups and see who's willing to join us. But we don't go in blind. We need a plan." Mara gave a firm nod, already moving to organize the survivors. "I'll make sure everyone's ready." As the survivors worked in the distance, Jamie took a deep breath and turned to Callie. She stood beside him, her rifle slung across her back, her face set with determination. "We'll make this work," he said quietly. Callie didn't respond with words. Instead, she just gave him a small, knowing smile, as though there were nothing more to say. She trusted him. She trusted that together, they could fight back against whatever came their way. But as the moonlight bathed the camp, Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something bigger than they could even comprehend. The Warden Collective was just the beginning. There were others out there, people who saw the collapse of civilization as an opportunity to seize control. And if they were going to succeed, Jamie knew they had to be ready for what came next. The price of hope was high. But it was a price worth paying. The morning arrived quietly, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. The survivors were already up, packing their belongings and preparing for the dangerous journey ahead. There was a palpable sense of urgency in the air, mixed with the faintest glimmer of hope. The revolution was real now, more than just an idea or a distant dream. It had taken root, and it was up to them to nurture it. Jamie stood at the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew that every step they took from here would be a risk, but he also knew that they couldn't stay hidden forever. The Warden Collective would come for them, sooner or later. And when they did, they would need to be ready. Mara approached, her face set in determination. "Everyone's packed. We're ready to move out." Jamie nodded, his gaze still fixed on the distant landscape. "We'll need to stay off the main roads. The collective will be watching. If we're going to find allies, we'll have to be stealthy." Callie walked up behind them, her expression tense. "We don't have time to waste. The longer we stay in one place, the more vulnerable we become. Let's find those groups and make them see that joining us is the only chance they have." Mara gave a sharp nod. "Agreed. But we also have to be careful. The collective has spies everywhere. They'll be looking for any sign of us." With one final glance around the camp, Jamie turned to face the survivors. They were ready, tired, but ready. They were no longer just scared individuals fighting to survive. They were a unified force, united by a single, unbreakable truth: they had a future to fight for. "Let's move," Jamie said, his voice steady and commanding. They moved out at dawn, keeping to the underbrush and taking the most circuitous route they could find. The dense forest surrounding them offered some cover, but it also slowed their progress. Every crack of a twig underfoot, every rustle of leaves, had Jamie on edge. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. If they were caught by the collective, there would be no second chances. As the hours passed, the group traveled in silence, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings for signs of danger. The road ahead was unclear, and every survivor group they encountered was a potential ally or an enemy. They couldn't afford to make the wrong choice. Finally, as dusk began to settle over the landscape, they arrived at a small, abandoned town on the outskirts of the area. It was quieter than the other places they had passed, and the buildings seemed untouched, as though the undead hadn't fully taken hold here yet. "This is it," Mara said, her voice low. "This is where we'll make our stand." Jamie surveyed the area, his eyes narrowing as he took in the quiet streets. Something didn't feel right. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it was too still, too calm. There should have been more signs of life, more movement. He trusted his instincts, and they were telling him to be cautious. Stay alert, he murmured to Callie and Mara, as they took positions behind a row of crumbling buildings. They moved carefully through the town, their senses heightened. The silence was unnerving, but they had to press forward. After a few tense moments, they finally spotted what they had been looking for, a group of survivors, huddled together in a makeshift barricade behind an old gas station. They were armed, their expressions wary but determined. Jamie approached them cautiously, his hands raised to show that he wasn't a threat. The group watched him closely, their fingers twitching around the triggers of their weapons. But when Mara stepped forward and spoke, the tension eased. "We've heard the broadcast," one of the survivors said, his voice gruff but hopeful. "You're the ones starting the revolution." Jamie nodded. "We're here to unite survivors. To fight back against the Warden Collective and the Undead. We can't do it alone. We need each other." The survivor's gaze flickered between Jamie, Mara, and Callie before he finally spoke again. "What makes you think we can trust you? What makes you think we can trust anyone in a world like this?" Jamie's heart sank for a moment, but he knew the answer. He had been where they were, scared, uncertain, and reluctant to believe in anything. But now, he had something to show them. Something that couldn't be denied. "Hope," Jamie said quietly. "We're offering hope. Not just for survival, but for something more. We've started something bigger than any of us, something that can take down the Warden Collective and build a new world. But we need your help." The survivor looked him over for a long moment, as if weighing his words, before nodding slowly. "All right," he said. "You've got our attention. But it's going to take more than words to win us over. If you want us to join your fight, you'll need to prove it." Jamie didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He pulled out the radio, the same one that had broadcasted the message that had started it all. "Listen," he said, his voice carrying across the airwaves. "This is for anyone who's still out there, still holding on to hope. The revolution has begun. The Warden Collective may think they've won, but we're here to show them otherwise. We're coming for them. Together." The words echoed through the air as the survivors around him looked on, their expressions shifting from skepticism to something else, something akin to belief. For the first time in a long time, they weren't just running. They were ready to fight. Jamie turned to the group of survivors in front of him. "We've got a war to win." And with that, the final stand began. The end. That wraps up your zombie story. Would you like any adjustments or additions, or do you have another project in mind?